Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And especially I want to thank Damien and Joanna for organising this conference. I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone's papers afterwards. And I'm sorry I can't be with you today. Unfortunately, I've got a number of flights. I just want to spend the 20 minutes that I have talking about the Kilmainham Gaol Graffiti project, which is a project that I completed between 2012 and 2014 primarily, but I've still been kind of residually working on it ever since. I quickly want to introduce the project and then talk about graffiti studies and approaches to the project. I'll present some findings and particularly focus on unexpected findings from the recording exercise. And then I want to look in some detail at what happened to the graffiti after the jail closed. And I think this is a point which is particularly important for these types of studies, is that we don't just study what we're trying to retrieve in 1920 from present day, but actually look at all the interactions in between that have shaped what we find whenever we eventually do study it. So just introducing Kilmainham Gaol, which I'm sure most people know quite well, but 2 points I think are quite important is one, that this is an iconic site from the decade of commemorations and is particularly tied into seminal points in Irish history, which are very much part of the national psyche, including the Easter Rising and the executions from it. What is less incorporated are the more problematic events, such as the Civil War. So I think this is, for me, quite an important aspect of the project, was trying to retrieve stories which are not necessarily that comfortable, because by not retrieving them, we were not really thinking about the gaps that are left, particularly in terms of gender, because women are most associated with this site from the decade of commemorations from the Civil War. And if we just want to drop the Civil War off the end of that decade, then we don't really include those important stories. The second point is really to look at the physical manifestation of the prison itself. I think what is interesting about it is, for it being a prison that was built in the late 18th century, it has wings from different periods. So the original West Wing, which is the single cells, but along kind of dark corridors in a traditional format, against the mid-19th century update, which is the East Wing, which is the panopticon style, which had the courtyard with cells around it and also a glass roof to allow light in. These are very different types of prison, and being put in either part of it was also seen as a different form of punishment for the prisoners during the Civil War, and I think that's something worthwhile to consider. Just to give a little shout out to the website that I've created and still wish to add to at some point further in the future, is the kilmainhamgaolgraffiti.com, in which I wanted to look at some of the narratives, some of the methods, and some of the findings that I had from the project, particularly looking at female experiences of imprisonment, something that I have also published quite a lot on. So if anyone's particularly interested, please feel free to contact me about it. So just to give a very brief outline of the project, Following the Fighters was an IRC funded project for 2012 to 14, and the aim was to record historic graffiti related to female prisoners at Kilmainham Gaol. Obviously the Civil War saw women held en masse for long periods at the site, and they were prolific graffiti creators. But because this is considered the most difficult period to remember, they're often written out of those narratives from the period. We have seen since 2016 that there's been increasing attempts to add women's stories, but I do still feel concerned that the Civil War is still too difficult to remember in detail for these stories to be reconsidered and fully formed as part of the national identity. So my aim with the project was to find these women, and particularly to reinsert their stories into public memory, hence why the website was considered an important part of the project. Even though it was a 2-year project, I spent around 6 months doing the field work, and that was focused on the west wing of the prison. The reason for that was because a lot of the walls had been chipped off in the east wing as part of the restoration efforts in the 1960s, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But from the initial 6 months of fieldwork, I took around 6,000 photographs, and I had an approach to the site, which was to systematically move around it in the same way, in the spaces in the same way. So to approach every cell, going in from the left-hand side and moving around it, to primarily focus on the kind of accessible parts of the cell. And what I found that actually there wasn't a lot of graffiti, which is really low to the ground or really high up, even though I searched for it. So this graffiti wasn't essentially being created to be hidden. It was created to be seen. There are some examples that we know were kind of more secretive, but the vast majority of it was not being hidden. After I finished the project, there was more research facilitated by OPW. In particular, they wanted me to look at the remnants from the East Wing and also to go into the courthouse, which was being renovated at that time. And so these other graffiti recordings revealed other inhabitants and many other stories. And we also, have to think about what kind of stories have been lost because so many of the walls were destroyed in the 1960s. And that's something I want to reflect on later. So graffiti studies often has a material aspect to it. There has been some really interesting archaeological studies, particularly the edited volume brought out by Jeff Oliver and Tim Neal in 2010. And they try to think of graffiti as a spatialized, materialized intervention, which has a landscape aspect to it. And also there could be multiple intentions. And I think that's important to take into account when we're looking at graffiti from Kilmainham Gaol. There's not singular reasons why the graffiti is there. It's often been viewed as linked to male identity and criminality or a mirror of the social self, but it is context specific, it is performative, and it is relational, as has been shown in archaeological studies, and it's important to take those aspects on. I think there have been issues in some of the studies in graffiti, and often the identification, recording techniques, and methodological approaches have been bypassed as common sense and not explicitly discussed. And this is something I tried to play with a little bit while I was doing the recording, where I had different techniques, and my techniques evolved over the course of completing the project, and also meant that I went back and re-recorded some of the parts of the site just to see how different I would approach it from the start to the end. And I found that I, did actually retrieve more graffiti on the second attempt, which, I was pretty clear that I have definitely not found everything there was to be found, but that I evolved how I was recording on depending on what I was finding and trying to include narratives that I hadn't been expecting. I think sometimes the term graffiti can be problematic because it is seen as being too simple. And it's got this link to criminality as well, which I think is not always that helpful. So I quite like Clark and Frederick's term mark making, because it also ties into all the different types of interactions with the wall, which are not necessarily just about putting a surface on it, but also digging into it. And that's what I found in my own research. Just to give an example of one of the more convoluted walls, this one is from what is known as the 1916 corridor, and I think it actually might be from Pierce's cell. But as you can see, there's multiple layers of graffiti. Some of it has been carved in, some of it has been painted on, others are pencil. There's lots of different layers of this, and it's almost impossible to be able to record all of it. But really, my aim was to try and retrieve the older ones and definitely the graffiti that I could connect to the Civil War period and before. As you can see with the engravings, a lot of those are quite a bit later, often up to the 60s, 70s, and even up to the 1990s. I think the cells were only properly closed from the public around the 1990s. So what I found, there was a huge collection of graffiti that covered many periods, there was many forms, and there was lots of issues around accessibility and recordability. Some of it was actually quite hard to see. Some of it I could see, but I couldn't photograph that well. Other bits photographed well, and I couldn't see that well. So there was a little bit of luck sometimes in being able to retrieve some of the graffiti. Some of it was made by pencil, others by pen, chalk, paint. There was engravings in various scales and forms, and also this is an impact of attempts to cover graffiti. As you could see probably from the last picture, there was attempts to whitewash and different types of whitewash, some of it quite thin, some of it quite thick. And because the site was left without any use for a number of decades, and the roof came in different parts, the access of water actually in some ways made it easier to find some of the earlier graffiti, because it took later layers of whitewash off. So that was, quite an interesting side effect I hadn't considered. There was some problems in gender in graffiti. It wasn't as difficult as maybe as I expected, because a lot of women like to write their names, and they like to write their names beside things they had drawn. But I still needed to be careful about making assumptions that, a picture of a woman was drawn by a woman, for example. So I tried to really not gender things, unless I was pretty sure that it was related to a named person. I did use other sources as well to try to better understand the graffiti, and this included historic photographs, autograph books from the time, memoirs that were written afterwards, and a range of official records. And I think that's quite important in terms of really approaching the subject in an interdisciplinary way rather than just trying to engage with the materials. So just to give some of the examples of some of the most common types of graffiti or mark making that I came across. To start with the middle, as I said, there was a lot of people wanted to materialize themselves on the walls. So there is a lot of evidence of people whenever they were leaving during the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, left their names, addresses, and the dates that they had been in and had left Kilmainham. So it's actually not that difficult sometimes to figure out who was writing the graffiti. In the bottom left-hand corner, as you can see, there's a really, quite attractive image of a woman, an idealized image. I found over 100 portraits, and these are often quite spectacular. And so there's something that you can focus on, but I tried to not over focus on things that are just aesthetically pleasing, but to think about actually what the graffiti tells us in the round about those experiences. The doorway on the right-hand side, you can just about make out, there is quite a lot of engravings on the doorways, but they were painted over afterwards. Some of them you can see quite well, some of them not so well. The top right, there is quite a lot of evidence of postcards and other pieces of paper being attached to the wall. Sometimes the only remnant is the glue ring from where they were stuck on the walls, and you can still see where that's there and often where it's came off. But sometimes in a few of the cells, there was actually parts of paper as well. And on the left, right-hand side, another issue of abandonment is that there was a lot of animals that obviously infiltrated the site, particularly birds. So there is bird poo everywhere. There was evidence of cats, dogs, rats, all sorts of things having been in some of those cells. And to start with, it was something I tried to ignore, but after a while, I again took some attempt to record some of it, just particularly when it interacted with the graffiti or destroyed it or covered it, just to show that these were processes that impacted on what we can say about the site today. So some of the unexpected findings, particularly from the East Wing and the ground floor of the West Wing, there was a lot of graffiti associated with British soldiers who were kept on the site, some of them imprisoned, some of them just barracked there between 1914 and 16. It's pretty clear that there was a crossover between some British soldiers who were being imprisoned for short periods of time in the cells when the rebels from 1916 came in. I actually did find some graffiti that actually related to that. But really, there was a lot of evidence of people who had a lot of time in their hands just being in cells and drawing pictures. There's a lot of moustache men, as you can see here, but also people writing their names. We have private, we could actually retrieve information about quite a few of the soldiers who left names behind. And interestingly, it's the only part of the prison that I also found images of like naked women, essentially things that you would expect to find in normal graffiti. They were always associated with the graffiti of British soldiers. It may just be a kind of coincidence, but I think they were probably connected. As I showed already, there is a lot of evidence of forced inhabitants marking their release, particularly at different points in the Civil War and at the end. Often they were released in significant numbers, so people often left their addresses behind so other people could find them, and they wanted to mark their presence on the site, and that's something that we see happening over and over again. As I noted before, there is also a lot of evidence of covering, but also attempts to uncover graffiti. You might be able to make out here that this is a piece of graffiti that has a map of Ireland. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner that you can just about make out Kerry. And you can also see that there's an attempt to score off the covering at the northeast, which I think is obviously what was being covered was a reference to partition. So it's quite strategic what is being covered. The whitewashing at this later period is not just random. It's mainly things that connect to critiques to do with the Civil War around partition, but also particular people's names start to be covered over as well. There's evidence after the prison closed that people came back at different periods of time to revisit the site. So we know this also from newspaper reports, and this has been reported in Rory O'Dwyer's book as well. But it seems particularly the women went back at particular periods en masse and added graffiti to the walls to re-presence themselves. So these examples are from the top floor of the West Wing, and this is where some of the women would have been kept. And it has very specific details about arrested by CID, legally and political prisoner. And then it says about the date that they actually came back, which was the 12th of March 1938. So we know that women from Kilmainham went back in 1938, and this is obviously being present in this graffiti. There's also some post-Civil War reassessments of who the heroes and villains are. Obviously, De Valera was a very important figure during the Civil War, but as people go back the decades after, he definitely takes on a more villainous role. And it's the main types of interactions with graffiti in which they're being scored out or covered over or to do with De Valera. If we can see the name underneath, it's nearly always him. And so lastly, I just want to look very quickly at the actions of the Kilmainham Gaol Restoration Committee, who were a group of volunteers who were allowed and facilitated by the government to kind of resurrect the site in time for the 1966 commemorations of the Easter Rising. And again, I'm quoting from O'Dwyer here, where he found in the Kilmainham Gaol Restoration Committee papers, nothing of or related to the period after 1921 would be identified with the Kilmainham project. It's interesting, the Civil War can't even be mentioned. It's just period after 1921. So a lot of the interactions that happened with the site happened in the East Wing, which I found whenever I did the later kind of tranche of graffiti recording. There was attempts initially to take off all the wooden surrounds of the doorways, but this only happened to a small number on the left-hand side on the ground floor. I think probably because it was quite cumbersome to get them off. But as you can see from this example on the right-hand side, there is quite a lot of graffiti on those doors, and often they were painted over. But I also found that there was a lot of strategic carving out as well. So quite a few of the doors had obviously had names that had been carved into the door, and then they had just been cut out so that there was a square there instead. And you can see this in quite a lot of places. So there's definitely attempts to censor and to take certain names out after the Civil War. A lot of the backs of the doors, so these would have been the inside of the door cells, were painted over to cover any of the graffiti which were on them. This wasn't done as effectively as the walls were. As you can see also from the surround, you can see the brick here because the walls have actually been hacked off. So this happened in the vast majority of cells in the East Wing. They just took all the walls off instead of trying to cover them. But they covered the back of the door sometimes in this black paint, which was quite effective at covering over graffiti. The doors that they didn't get actually did have quite a lot of graffiti on them, including from made by pins. So this is an example of what one of the walls looks like. This is just a normal, example of a wall, and effectively all the plaster has been taken off it, so you can't retrieve any graffiti whatsoever. Often the plaster is just dumped in the floor and is still there now. And I did actually try and look at some of the dumps of plaster just in case I could find any graffiti, but I wasn't able to retrieve any. There's also just some weird interactions which I've had different kind of responses as to what they are. So in the cellar underneath the basement, underneath the East Wing, there was a lot of graffiti in those in the corridor in particular, the main corridor. And as you can see from this example, you can see there's definitely words there, but it's quite hard to read. And this has been covered in a really kind of quite shiny brown paint that makes it really hard to photograph, but also it just covers over a lot of the lighter graffiti. And I was told by my colleagues at the jail that this was done by a TV company who had hired out the basement to do some filming because they wanted it to make it look more like a prison. I don't know what the film that they were making was. I wasn't told that, but I was told that the director at the time did kick them out whenever he had seen they'd covered this. But effectively they covered the entire walls downstairs with this horrible brown paint. A last thing that they did, to change the narratives of the site was to change the dates that things happened. So there are very few women who actually have a plaque added to the walls. These were done again in the 1960s. And if you see those little white plaques over the doors, and really only Countess Markovich and a few other people have them, including Sheila Humphreys, who has her name obviously in the anglicised style. But they also put in the date that she was held in her cell as 1921, which isn't accurate. She was held in that cell in 22 to 23. So during the Civil War period. So there was always this attempt to tie anyone's name back to the War of Independence rather than to the Civil War, which is actually when most of the graffiti was created. So just some final thoughts as I finish off this paper, and hopefully have not went over too much. Places that have the most pronounced connections to difficult past can continue to have the potential to change in meaning. So I think this is important in considering somewhere like Kilmainham, which is already very firmly established in the public imagination as attached to certain things, particularly the executions of the Easter Rising rebels. But there are different narratives that can emerge from that site, and there have been different narratives that have continued to do so. In Ireland, the impetus to change has often been tied to commemorative periods, especially connected to the Easter Rising commemorations. But for this decade of centenaries, there's been public interest and government funding to span an entire decade, and we have seen quite a lot of changes and new narratives. Much has been written about how the mood of the nation has shaped and been shaped by commemoration. The focus on women has been particularly strong, and particularly also this desire to reconsider what Irish identity is at a time that also we have to acknowledge contemporary politics, including Brexit. So from an archaeological perspective, we should consider the material and immaterial changes that create these new futures at such sites. The existence of what Olivier calls material memory is particularly important, because even whenever we don't try to remember different past, as long as there's material memory of them, then they can be retrieved at different points in time into the future. But we also need to acknowledge that a lot of the change of meaning at sites of Kilmainham Gaol is not just about the materials, but also about our changing societal context. So thank you very much.